So welcome to Burnley, and we're going to be looking at a pit today that we've got quite a lot of information about. Apart from the old Broadheadmore colliery, this is one of the pits that again we've got an abundance of information, but this dates from certainly starting at the 1720s. And let me familiarise you. Here we've got Burnley football ground, Turf Moor. We've got the Leeds and Liverpool Canal down there to Finsley Gate Wharf, Tesco's, Centenary Way, the bus station, and particularly what we're going to look at is this area where the Central Library is, and there's the Magistrate Court, and Thompson's, the old Thompson Centre used to be there. So the Fulledge Estate, I can't give you the exact dimensions because I admit I don't know it, but it kind of ran down Todmorden Road. We used to have the Fulledge House that's now been demolished. That's got a massive mining history. Down to Brunshaw Road. And Brunshaw Road, as we will say in the video, again is quite a boundary as far as the pits are concerned. The estate ran up St James Street to the town centre, what is now Manchester Road. That was the New Bull Hotel, which was part of the estate. This used to be Market Street, and it ran, as far as I know, to the Calder. And I don't know the boundaries down here, I must admit. So this is the location of the old colliery we're going to be looking at. So what is the geology in Burnley? Because many people won't think there was pits in Burnley Town Centre. But Burnley, it's known as a basin. All the coal seams dip away from the surface quite severely, really, to be honest with you. But in Burnley Centre itself, some of the highest coals, when I say highest, I mean the middle coal measures, geologically higher in the strata, are situated around the town centre. Let's just have a look. So here we have the geological survey superimposed on the first Ordnance Survey map. There you can see Fulledge House, and there we've got the old Fulledge Colliery. Here's the Burnley Straight Mile coming along to Finsley Gate Wharf. And this is the pit we're going to be looking at here. So I'll try to simplify this for the layman. As you can see, these black lines are actually the coal outcrops, and the coal is actually dipping up towards the towards the north in this area. This is the highest coal seam up in the strata. Have you seen the name? Doghole Mine. Don't forget, in Lancashire, coal seams are known as mines. Collieries are collieries and pits are pits, but the seams are mines. Why is it called a dog hole? Well, the theory is that they used to sort of put a dog down there on a rope to see if the air was okay. I don't know if that's really true or not. But the dog hole is round Fulledge. It is only about 16 yards deep, and it is 5 feet thick of decent coal. Next in line, we've got the Kershaw Mine, and that is a split seam with dirt partings. And then we've got the shell bed, or the shell coal, the shell mine, which is known in this area as the top bed, and it was worked at the pit that we're going to be talking about. Underneath that, we've got the Burnley 4 foot, and again, that is was one of the old main seams in the Burnley Centre. These coals date from our great granddad's period, if you know what I mean. The last of these higher up coals were worked in around about 1776 at the old Whittlefield. So the modern pitmen, we just don't know anything about working these coal seams. But these are all under the town centre. Now these white lines are geological faults where the strata has actually slipped and moved. I'll just show you a bit closer. And this is actually at the pit that we're looking at. The black lines again are coal seams. Can you see that they're angled because it's in a basin? That's the old thick bed, or the Burnley 4 foot. And you can see that is a geological fault. That is where the coal has slipped. It looks like a broken leg, really, like a fracture, doesn't it? But that is what a geological fault does. Sometimes these faults can be really big. They can be 900 feet displacement, and sometimes there can be a few inches of displacement. We're going to come back to this map later on. So we're going to be looking at the town centre then between this fault, which is known as the Cliviger Valley Fault, and this fault, which is known as the Fulledge Fault. and there's many different little smaller faults, as you can see. So this is the area we're going to be looking at in particular as we get on.
Welcome to Burnley. Now we've got our feet on the ground rather than stuck in front of maps. Where we are actually now, outside the famous Turf Moor football ground and what used to be the Beehole end. This used to be part of the old Beehole colliery, and there used to be a house at the end that was to do with the pit, and the pit is actually up the back here. In fact, there's a very old movie-tone thing from about 1904 that has the only footage of the Beehole colliery on. There's no photographs in existence, but it's actually Burnley. I think it's Burnley against Man United, something like 1904, and the pit's on in the background. So this is where the Beehole colliery was, owned by the executors of John Hargreaves, who we're going to talk about today. But of course, we're here to talk about the pit that was in Burnley Centre and the Fullage estate, aren't we? So we're going to have a bit of a walk around some of the sites that I've shown you on Barclay's map. There's nothing to see at all, but we can still show you where things were.
And this is where the Beehole colliery was. There we've got the old Turf Moor, the Beehole end, and there's actually the pit. We see the bit of land going down to the house here by the side of where, near where I'm stood, and that's sort of the memorial park. But the actual Ginny from the Beehole went back this way to what's known as the turnings that came across on the Rowley colliery Ginny Road. When you get to the turnings there, you could go across to Bank Hall, and coal was sent across the Bank Hall colliery, or it went straight down to the canal, which is just about here. Some of it was underground. Actually, if you look at that road, there's actually a road now on top of where the tunnel was, and it came down to the canal just there. And if we look, there's where the lime kilns are, and it's just opposite the lime kilns that's in the B&M gardens there. So that was where the Beehole tramway came down from the old Beehole pit. And when I was at Apton Valley as a young trainee, mechanical apprentice actually, one of the firemen, and I think we were up the M8 district, I wasn't taking out rings, I was working with Stu Babe, and they had a tractor up there, an old FSV that drank about 4 tins of Easy Start every day, and we used to go up there every day. One of the firemen up there had actually started at Beehole. Kind of wish you wish you knew then what you knew now, and ask the questions, don't you?
Right, we're at the side of Fullage Road now. So yeah, this is a terrible place to film, noise-wise, but this is an important place. Behind me, we've got where the end of the Fullage estate was. Fullage House used to be along this road here, going to Townley Gates. And if you look behind us, back down towards Turf Moor, on the corner there, that is where the Beehole royalty ended. And on the side of Brunshaw Road that I am, just on the other side, that was like a boundary of Townley collieries as well. So this is a big boundary mineral wise. Now looking back at Barclay's map, if we look across the road, we can see where one of the shafts was. It was actually near Blakey Street, which is just behind. Well, this ground behind us was owned by Colonel John Hargreaves, and if we look on the tithe map, we can see where the pit was, and again on Barclay's map we can see the shaft there. We know nothing about it. The only way that we know it was there is because it was on Barclay's map. It's not even shown on the tithe map as a pit, really, but we've just got those 2 ponds, so possibly there was a steam engine. This engine pit, which again could be down back here towards the canal embankment. We'll walk down there now and have a look.
So the famous Barclay's map. Let's do what we can with this. We've got the Burnley Straight Mile here, we've got Finsley Gate Wharf, and the Fullage colliery here, showing the Fullage royalty. There we are, engine pit, the 3 shafts associated with the then Fullage colliery. I can't go into detail about the individual plots of land. Here we see 44 and what have you. I can't at present. But what have we got? Right, we come down what was Todmorden Road, and we find this shaft here, which we're going to talk about obviously as we're on the when we're talking online, near Blakey Street. Now, thinking about it, I'm looking at this number 44, And is that the Beehole royalty? We talk online that the Beehole royalty stops at the end of Burnley football field there, but we can see it's going into there. So is that part and parcel of the Beehole royalty? George Hayes, in fact, in his book talks about the first Beehole colliery, but with no reference to it one bit whatsoever. But there it is. Now as we go down towards the canal, we can see this shaft here. Again, there is no evidence of it at all. Nothing to say that it was actually there. What it is down to, possibly the dog hole mine again. Possibly it is where the end of the Beehole Ginny was, when the proper Beehole colliery was working. Barclay's map isn't exactly that accurate.
So this was all Hargreaves land, as I say, back to where the shaft was up there on Blakey Street, and another one was this way towards the canal embankment. We can see that where these other 4 lime kilns are. And that building looks really old, and it sounds like there's some really nasty dogs there as well. So nobody's going to want us rooting in there, are they? Again, you just never think there was any collieries here at all. Probably early on they were down to the dog hole mine. That's what we're thinking.
So let's get at the other side of the canal, and there we've got a shaft next to the cat's whiskers. Yeah, showing me age, Anna. However, on the tithe map of 1832, that says that's in a timber yard that's owned by Peregrine Townley. But nevertheless, Barclay has put it on the map. It is there.
I just wanted to discuss something while we were near the aqueducts as well. Obviously this is not the original. It used to look an awful lot different. We'll put a photograph up of it. But back in the 1840s, the early 1840s, Chartism was big and it was coming to a head. Around about 1842 we had the general strike, sometimes called the plug riots, but it was all tied up with Chartism. The social unrest was a big thing then, trying to get votes, charters put through, and a lot of equality. Anyway, I'll put the date up, but this was a scene around 1841 of a visit of Fergus O'Connor. Who was Fergus O'Connor? Well, Fergus O'Connor was one of the Chartist leaders. And he paid a visit to Burnley, and they reckon there was a crowd of over 60,000 lined the streets to see Fergus arrive, and then to listen to him give speeches that evening. He got off the train. I'm not sure if he didn't get off the train either at Todmorden or Halifax, I forget which, because the train then hadn't come all the way to Burnley. And he was brought in by horse and carriage, and from at least Burnley Wood, the road was lined and thronged with people. In fact, they reckon the woods round Burnley Wood actually rung with the echoes of people cheering Fergus. And when they came through the arch here, the newspaper reporter said it was like them coming through one of the Roman triumphal arches. And Fergus went up into the town centre, and there was a platform, a stage, a ground. I'm not sure exactly where he gave the speeches from. But there was a big contingent from Bake Up here, which is interesting to us, and also Padiham. In fact, one of the Bake Up Chartists opened up for Fergus. The proceedings went on till about midnight apparently, and then the day following Fergus went to Corn. And even though it was tipping it down with rain, he was met at Briarfield and marched all the way in by again another throng of people, and a massive crowd turned up at is it the Cotton Hall in Corn. But one thing he would have passed opposite here now is where the cat's whiskers used to be, and if you look at our map, there was a coal shaft there. I don't know if that was part of Hargreaves' pit, because that land in the 1830s was actually on Townley land. It gives the owner of Peregrine Townley. And again, we know no history of that shaft, but let's have a look in where possibly there was an engine pit, and we've got a couple of lime kilns still there.
So here we are, 1809, engine pit. It's difficult on Barclay's map to tell exactly where it is, but I want to show you something. Let's have a look. There we have the end of the Rowley tramway, which Beehole was part of, obviously, from the what's known as the turnings. Is that where the other shaft was that we've just shown? I can't say, but this is what I'm looking at here. Engine Street. Now I can't say that it is anything to do with the old colliery, I can't, but there we have Engine Street. Look at the other names: Forest Street, Lindsay Street, Hart Street, Adlington Street. Why is that called Engine Street? I'll leave that with you. These are little bits of history that we have to just put together. We can't say anything definite, but we say, look, this is a possibility, this is maybe a theory.
So again, we're near where I'm actually stood on top of a couple of lime kilns that's left that were constructed by the canal company. The canal came through something like 1796 to 1801, and these were built, I believe, by the canal company to provide quicklime for mortar and what have you for them. Well, we've got quite a lot of reports and documentation of lime coming from here at Burnley and going up into the Whitworth area. We've got accounts of that I found in Bill Lloyd's archive. So a lot of lime was in Burnley, Clitheroe, on that sort of neck of the woods. That's where a lot of the limestonation was produced, but obviously it was being burnt here as well, and they were picking it up from Rosendale here also. Now then, what am I on about? Well, you're for mining, not lime, although coal and lime, they go together. On our map of Barclays, it shows two engine pit. Well, it shows an engine pit, 1809, and that is really interesting. Now, there was a court case in the 1850s of two mills, Fulledge Mill being one, and there was one just opposite. They're either side of the Calder, I believe, to each other, and it's a long, drawn-out court case that's documented in the newspaper, and it mentions these drainage guites from the old Fulledge pit. That's how we know that they came to this side of the canal as well. The canal was actually built on top of one of the guites. There's maybe quite a few guites, and it's hard to understand exactly what it is he's really talking about. But what it alludes to is a court case around about 1832, which I've tried to look into, but I can't find anything. It went to the Court of Chancery, and have I got the name right? A guy by the name of Margison, and they had a print works. Is it Caldervale Print Works? Perhaps somebody can tell us. And the problem he had was this engine pit, which obviously, when we say engine pit, it's a drainage shaft, isn't it? You know, we talked about the water wheel over at Fulledge Colliery. Well, here, according to this newspaper article, it said this was the first steam pumping engine in the Burnley area. And I originally thought perhaps it was down near the library, but looking at Barclays map, it shows engine pit behind me, just where they've cleared all that land off now, so to speak. You know, Barclays map isn't exactly that accurate, is it? But that is possibly the pumping shaft where this steam engine was, more than likely a Newcomen type, with it being from that era. But the newspaper goes on to say that as a result of that case back in 1832, the court found in favour of Margison, because they were pumping dirty water, slutchy car ochre water out the pit and putting it into the river, which then he was getting the same water out the river for his print works. It didn't work, did it? You know, so they actually had an injunction, and it says in the newspaper that the pit was closed for about 4 years, but I haven't been able to find out anything more about it, because the newspaper I've found this in is talking about a case about the 1860s. So was it that engine shaft? Is that where the first steam engine was? We don't know, but at least now we know there was a steam engine. So the Fulledge estate, basically, back in those days, it extended right round from what is now all those streets on Todmorden Road. Like I said, Fulledge House is now gone. That's where Townley Park Gates was. But we've got a natural barrier, as I said, which is the canal. It's not natural, but you know what I mean. It's a feature that now it separates the two halves of what were the Fulledge estate. So it's hard to think that a lot of the estate was actually in the town centre, towards Bullcroft, the bottom of Manchester Road, which was, in those days, it was Market Street, where the turnpike road went up to Manchester. And so that was part of the estate. Now the thing about this pit is that it's one of the first collieries in Burnley that there's a lot of information for. And a lot of this information, it's come from Bennett's History of the Burnley Coalfield. We've got some off Jack Naden, but we've also got from a book by a guy that many people perhaps haven't heard of. And he's a guy by the name of George Hayes. And he was a pitman. He was a pitman's pitman, really. He was mad on the mining history, and he actually wrote a book which was never published. There's a copy in Burnley Library, and I think there's possibly a copy over at Accrington as well. And the thing with George, he died in the early 1970s, I believe. I'll get that right. But he went back, and he could talk to people who'd lived at the end of the 1800s that he'd worked with, that had known the coalfield from then. In fact, I think his granddad actually started as an 8-year-old at a pit in Padiham or at Reed, because he was from over that neck of the woods. So a lot of the information that we're going to talk about on the Burnley coalfield is actually from George Hayes. And George really needs recognising, he really does. And a big shout out for the work that he's actually done. Now then, the Fulledge estate was originally owned by the Inghams, but they fell on hard times, and around about 1720, they sold it for just over £2,000 to a guy by the name of Henry Blackmore. Now, Henry Blackmore was married to one of the Holt family, but we're not sure which branch of the Holt family it was. But it is important that he was married to a lady by the name of Holt. Now, Henry developed the Fulledge colliery, or other people developed it, and he let them. And there's actually a plan of the pit that was developed in Townley Hall, and it's in a couple of publications. It's in Jack's book as well, so obviously I can't reproduce that. And it shows the water wheels that they had, because one shaft was about 15-16 yards deep and the other was 26 yards deep, and the one at 26 yards deep acted as a pumping shaft, and it was water power that pumped it. It was basically a water wheel that drove a chain, and on that chain were buckets, and literally it was very primitive. The buckets descended the shaft on the chain, went to the bottom into the sump, filled up, came up and were emptied. Now the power to the water wheel was provided through the River Calder through a gate. What's a gate? Well, a judge asked the same question in the 1850s. A gate is basically a water channel, and there were two gates to the Calder. One to bring water in to drive the wheel, and another to take water away from the pit. Now then, at some point this gate was extended, right, well, actually the canal was built on top of it later. But a bit more, we'll talk more of the Fulledge pit there in a later video. We're going to concentrate on what was at this side, on the other side of the estate. Now then, Henry Blackmore died. I'll tell you the date, I'll put the date of his death, and his widow married the Reverend John Hargreaves. And this is where we make a start on the Hargreaves collieries and our interest on the Bullcroft side.
So we're going to try and discuss then the ownership of the collieries, and one or two people have described it through the Exors of John Hargreaves, the executors, but it's been oversimplified. I think there's a lot more to it than initially meets the eye. So we've had a look into the family, not only myself but other people. John Hargreaves then, what is his family lineage? Remember, we've got the collieries owned in Burnley by the Hargreaves, but also the Rosendale collieries are owned by a different branch of Hargreaveses. And we are wondering if the two families do meet up at some point. But to really study the Hargreaves family is difficult, because the Hargreaveses of the Burnley collieries actually come from Rosendale. They come from down Goodshire Fold, and I think I might have traced them back to Newchurch as well. It's very complicated. So we also have another Hargreaves family out of Goodshire that end up owning a lot of property around Whitworth. Can you see how involved it gets? So let's keep simple. Here we have Colonel John Hargreaves, who is credited on owning the collieries. He carries the company name. So where is he from? What is his family lineage? Well, there's his dad, James Hargreaves, and his uncle, the Reverend John Hargreaves. He's very important. Let's click on him. He was born in the mansion house in Goodshire Fold, Lancashire. Where's the mansion house? Well, sadly, it's no longer there, but thanks to Peter Fisher's website, Smugmug, this is a photograph of the mansion house. It was just as you were coming into the village from the Kippax end, from the Crawshabooth end. That's one view of the house. And there we have another view of the house. Sadly, it's no longer there. Now, I believe that the Hargreaves owned another property where Colonel John Hargreaves also lived. And again, that is no longer there. So the Reverend John, well, he marries Betty Holt. Now, she's the kingpin in this. Who is Betty Holt? Well, we don't really know much of her lineage at all, what branch of the Holt family she's from. But it's very interesting because she was married previously. She was married to Henry Blackmore, who owned the Fulledge estate. As we said before, he bought the estate off the Inghams for over £2,000, and she was married to him. But he died, so she became a widow, and she married the Reverend John Hargreaves. The Reverend John, had a brother, James Hargreaves, named after his father, James Hargreaves. And he married Esther Heap, who we believe was born in Gambleside village. She certainly came from there, and there's a big family connection all around with Gambleside village. Now, they had 3 children. They had Anne Hargreaves, James Hargreaves, John as well, who became Colonel John. Now, when Betty died, she left her husband John, and he had inherited the collieries. I believe around about 1897 he started buying up all the colliery leases. But who was he buying them off? This is the important thing. Where was he buying them from? We'll possibly answer that. Now, when he died in 1812, John and Betty, they'd had no children. So the Fulledge estate and the collieries were divided. The pits got divided between James Hargreaves, his nephew, and John Hargreaves, also his nephew. Now, possibly they'd had something to do with the running of the pits beforehand. But they weren't the only people to benefit from the Fulledge estate. Betty's nephew, Nicholas Grimshaw, also benefited from the Fulledge estate. He was part and parcel of that estate. It got divided between them. So we don't know where the Grimshaws come in, and I would really like to know. Most of the credit goes to John Hargreaves. He became a colonel in the local militia. There's lots of stories that are totally wrong, but he became part of the local militia because after the American Civil War and then the French Revolution, the authorities were frightened of civil unrest, and the local militias really were strengthened. So that's where John Hargreaves got his colonelship from. Now, we credit most of the mining to him. However, we have his brother James, and on a lot of the early documents and newspapers, James is mentioned. In fact, they seem to trade as James and John Hargreaves. And I found other places, and I can't remember the exact wording, but they were trading sort of along the lines of the Marsden and Habergam Coal Company. I don't think it was Coal Company, but certainly Marsden and Habergam were there. Marsden, Briarfield, the Marsden Colliery, and the Habergam Colliery was the old Broadhead Moor off Rosendale Road. That is what they were running at the time. Now, James died 1830. He was only survived by his brother by 4 years. But in that 4 years, obviously, the collieries became, in his name, it was John Hargreaves. So when John died, it became the executors of Colonel John Hargreaves. Well, who was the company then? But we need to look really at who Colonel John married. He married Charlotte Ormerod, the daughter of Lawrence Ormerod of Ormerod House in Cliviger. And Ormerods can trace the way right back, probably to a Viking thane actually. The manor of Rochdale was owned by Gamel. Actually, it was his lands extended right into Yorkshire. It was the manor of Elland, but he also owned part of Rochdale, and his son was called Orm, and he purchased lands apparently around Cliviger. Now, we can measure land by rods, acres, rods and perches. So Orm bought a measure of land, or a rod of land in Cliviger. So it became Orm's rod. That is the story, the backstory. So the Orm rods can trace away back to Cliviger, certainly to at least the 1200s. And Gambleside village also was predominantly Orm rods. Cliviger and Gambleside, they're next door to each other. And on old Elizabethan documents, Gambleside is actually called Gamelside. Remember Gamel the Thane, or Orm's father? Interesting, isn't it? Charlotte Anne, she married James York Scarlett, who really distinguished himself in the charge of the Heavy Brigade. That is who she married. Eleanor married the Reverend Thursby, and it was when Colonel John Hargreaves died, the collieries passed really to Scarlett and to Thursby. Well, the land did. When you look at some of the old leases, it says landowners, Scarlett and Thursby, and then it says leasees, the executors of Colonel John Hargreaves. So the collieries then became into the hands of Charlotte and Eleanor. John obviously died quite young. So that is the history, or the beginnings of Hargreaves Collieries of Burnley. But if the Reverend John Hargreaves did go around buying pits, buying all the leases, who did he buy them off? That is a big question that has not yet been addressed. Well, the answer to that question, thanks to Richard Matthews, we might have got some way in solving. Richard got sent these documents quite a while ago, and this lady had looked up a lot of the history through the Coal Board records, but as you can see, they're coming from the North Yorkshire County Records Office there in North Allerton, and it's referring to, let's have a look, the items donated, blah de blah, 7 letters relating to coal mine management in the parishes of Burnley and Colne between John Coates, Roger Coates and Luke Yarker. It also includes a 1744-45 counterpart lease between John the Duke of Montague to Luke Yarker of Burton in Bishopdale. Now the Duke of Montague, those lands passed to the Duke of Buccleuch. I forget exactly how they are, but it became the Duke of Buccleuch's land. So they were leasing the Yarkers, because it mentions also John and Luke Yarker on many other documents that they were working the pits beforehand. And another document states that Hargreaves had bought the leases up that the Yarkers had worked. So we've got a lot more investigation to do into the Yarkers, but at least we now know that they exist. So that's possibly who the Hargreaves family had bought all these leases off. These are the 2 kilns that's left. It's good that they've been preserved, really, isn't it? A whole industry that's now gone by the lime industry. And this is a new industry that we have these days. B&M, Starbucks, TK Maxx. And behind us there's the Kirby Hotel. Not what it was, but there used to be a brewery there, believe it or not. And the brewery, well, it needed water. And they put a well down, a bit like a mine shaft. And the well goes right through all the coal seams that were worked at these little Burnley pits here. In fact, there's a bit of a shaft, there's a borehole section of it on the borehole plans of the British Geological Survey. We'll have a look. So here we are now then, at one of the oldest recorded collieries in Burnley. Behind me is Parker Lane. Back in the early 1800s, that was just a rough track, a single track as well, and they reckon there was fences up there that were sort of half broken down. Most of this was just fields,
I'm not sure if in Bennett it sort of talks about a mint field here as well. The pit road is behind me. That's now called Grimshaw Street. And where we're at now, we're next to the library at this side and the magistrates court on the other side, and this is where the shaft was for Hargreaves' colliery. And if you look on that Barclays map, it shows it working in 1809. It probably, quite possibly, dates back at least to the 1740s. I'll tell you why. Not the 1740s, sorry, the 1770s. Back in the 1770s, on Townley land, a group of people applied to Townley to open a pit at Hapton Hall Farm and Clough. I'm not sure of the exact location, but some of the names are quite interesting. Henry Winterbottom from Goodshire Chapel is mentioned. He was one of the partners, as was a Robinson. Now, there was a Robinson, and Henry Winterbottom himself were the forerunners of the George Hargreaves, Ashworth Hargreaves, Rosendale collieries. Anyway, why am I mentioning that? Well, Townley gave them permission, but according to George Hayes, he said that he had no idea how much they should charge for the coal. Now, it was the Arley mine that they were mining there at Hapton Hall. So what he did, he found out at this pit, he said Major Hargreaves, Hargreaves' colliery in Fulledge, well, this would be it at the time. They were charging 6p, 6d per load. Well, how big's the load? And again, this is a fantastic find in George Hayes, because George Hayes tells us exactly how much a load of coal was. Now, in those days, there were no rails. What they did, they dragged wicker baskets or whiskets on sledges, and they filled the baskets with coal, dragged them. The drawers, usually children, wore the belt and chain. So around the waist, they had a thick leather belt and a chain passed through the legs, attached to the sled on which was the loaded carf or whisket. Now, George Hayes gives the dimensions of those whiskets. He says they're 30 inches long, 20 inches wide, and 10 inches deep. Now, that is brilliant, because not long ago at Bill Lloyd's, we came across the original lease for one of the old Hogshead collieries. Forget the date, is it 1804 or something like that? But on that lease, it stipulates how big a load of coal should be, how big the basket should be, and the exact same dimensions, 30 by 20 by 10 inch deep. So that was obviously a standard. And Bill worked it out as well, but George Hayes tells us they would hold about 120 pounds, or 100 weight and a fifth. And the size of the carf is not designated by the height of the seam. It's designated really by how much could be pulled along like a dog, if you will. They were beasts of burden with the children back in those days. We've no records in the Hargreaves collieries of any women working. Certainly not by 1840 they weren't, but that doesn't mean to say that in the early days, in the 1700s, they didn't. We just have no evidence to say that they were. So the pit here, what did it consist of? Well, for a start, as Barclay shows us, there was two shafts. There was one here, actually there was two shafts here, according to another estate map, and another working shaft near the dry dock at Finsley Gate Wharf. The shaft itself looks to have been just underneath the magistrates' court, and it appears on the boreholes on the BGS site, but it's interesting, we'll show it yet anyway on the BGS site if we haven't shown it yet. And I reckon it's about 130 yards down to the 130 feet down to the Burnley 4-foot mine, which is directly beneath us. So originally they were probably working the Burnley 4-foot. They certainly worked the top bed or the shell, as it shows on this borehole plan as well. And interestingly, later on they worked the Arley mine through this particular pit, and that's how it appears on the first edition Ordnance Survey map. If we look at that, we can see the coal stave, the shaft's closed, it shows us coal stave, and it shows a tramway down to a drift. And the drift is right under Tesco's. And the colliery by then was known as the Burnley Drift Pit, and it appears on the 1841 Shaftesbury report into the labour of women and children underground. We'll have a look at what it says about Burnley Drift and also Fulledge.
So this is from the 1841 Shaftesbury report into the employment of women and children underground, and this is the pertinent item we're looking at, the drift mine, which is Burnley Drift, executors of the late John Hargreaves Esquire. It tells us that they've got one child of 10 years old who can't write, but he can read, and he attends Sunday school and public worship and gets wages of 6 shillings 6 a week. There's a further child of 14 years old. They don't particularly call him a child, but it is. And then one of 17. Neither of these can read. Both attend Sunday school and public worship. I would imagine that these three are drawers. Wages 9 shillings average. One gets 11, the other gets 7 shillings. The hours of work are the same as those I've previously named, which, as he talks about other Burnley pits, it's from 8 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon, but sometimes till 6. The seams of coal are 4 foot thick, no drawing by belt and chain, and no necessity for the employment of young children. So if you're 10, you're obviously not classed as a young child. The ventilation is by up and down shaft, and no loss of life has occurred for some years past. The number of adults employed is 10, so they've got 10, maybe 10 colliers. There is a sick fund and an accident fund, a school and lending library attached to these works. And he goes on to send a bit of a list here of rules to do with the Burial Society held at the Back Lane National School. There's the rules to do with the Burial Society, read and approved. There, William Thursby, Ormerod House. Rules and orders and regulations of the Colliers Accident Society, established 10th of March 1834. We haven't got time to read all this, obviously. And then we get a list of books that's in the lending library. Oh, there you go. I don't think even in times to come Karl Marx would have got in there somehow or other. But it's interesting to see all this. That's just a repeat of that. So a little window into what was available at for some of the Burnley pitmen in those days. But it's interesting to see that a 10-year-old is not classed as a young child. And we see at the Fulledge pit, it's then worked by Thomas Grimshaw. Like we said, the Grimshaws, Nicholas was the nephew of Betty, and I think they divided the estate around about 1814. Anyway, at the Fulledge colliery there, ages, they've got 2 of 10 years old, 2 of 11, and 4 of 12. Of these, 1 can write, 4 can read. Consequently, 50% cannot read. Wages, well, a bit less wages here, average 4 shillings and 3 per week, the highest being 7 shillings. We've got 2 13-year-olds, 4 of 14, 3 of 15, 1 of 16 and 3 of 17. Of the above children and young persons, 2 are trapdoor tenders, so we've got trapper boys there in Burnley. It's I've got it written in stone there. 2 are gin drivers or engine drivers. These are all children. 1 a coal getter is 17 years old. The rest are drawers or hurriers. 30 adults are employed. The hours of work amount to 8 per day. Originally, the children work in 1 hour less than the adults. The meals as usual in this district are taken at irregular times, each one taking his own time and convenience. The height of the main road is 33 inches. No belt and chain is used. The coal is forwarded on tram wagons containing 3.5 hundredweights. The younger assisting the stronger as structures or pushers behind the wagons. No loss of life at any time by gases or falls, and carbonic gas is sometimes found, but the usual mode of ventilation is sufficient to keep the mine clear. There is no Sunday school, sick fund or lending library connected with these works at the Fulledge colliery. So here we have Joseph Dickinson's map, which shows part of Burnley on it, and this is the only sort of plan we have of Fulledge colliery. Can you see where he shaded it in? It might be hard for you to interpret. There's the Burnley Straight Mile down to the gasworks, and this is where the Burnley Drift comes in. And he actually shows that level tunnel, which is the drift, going up as a tunnel into the Arley mine, and we can see this shaded area here, which is the area that it has worked. That is the Burnley Drift on Joseph Dickinson's map. If we look at it on a better estate plan, we can see there's the shaft under the Magistrates Court, and there is the actual drift entrance. There's the Calder going underneath the canal, and the drift entrance runs in. There is another shaft, as we know, on the canal bank, which is there. Here's Finsley Gate Wharf. There's the dock, and that is the other pit that's going in there. Now these workings have been the Burnley Forfeit mine, and these workings here are in the top bed, the shell. Can you see the Calder forms a boundary between this and the other Fulledge colliery, and there's an unknown shaft there as well. So the level drift goes in to meet the Arley mine coming down, and here we find the actual Hargreaves pit that was a pit in its own right in the 1840s. There we see the pithead buildings, the lodge, probably for a steam engine, and there's the shaft, and the drift actually goes through and intersects the workings there and another shaft. Actually, it shows the drift going a lot further up. We don't know about that. But this was the scene of an incident that Jack Naden talks about in the 1840s. I'll recite it out of Jack's Northern Mines book, and it's September 1848. It says, on Thursday afternoon, a person named William Whittaker was at work in a coal mine near Hargreaves, Burnley, when by some accident the rope broke and he was precipitated to the bottom. He was so dreadfully injured that he died on the Sunday morning. And we go on to the inquest. Mr. Whittaker was 31 years of age, and he was the engine tenter at the Hargreaves engine pit. He had care of the pumps there. On the Thursday afternoon, he was let down the pit a distance of about 100 yards. So have we got the depth of that as being 100 yards? And he was going to repair one of the lower lift buckets for the pumps. When he was finished, he gave the signal to be, well, he was nearly finished, and he gave the signal to be hoisted up a little. He was then let down to the former place when the rope close to the pit top broke, and he fell to the bottom a distance of 21 yards. So that shaft is at least 121 yards deep. Now this is where we learn something really interesting. On seeing that the rope had broke, the men on the pit top went up a drift that goes into the hillside and into the pit, being about 50 yards from the top of the shaft. Now that's interesting, because I would say the Hargreaves shaft there is certainly more than 50 yards away from the Burnley drift mouth. But you could perhaps say that that was within 50, well, yeah, but that's closer to the two. Nevertheless, obviously, they didn't descend the shaft, but they came up into the drift. When they got there, they called out several times as they could hear him move, and at last he replied by telling them, "Raise the Tommy," which is an iron vessel which the coals are raised. When they did so, they found that the deceased had fallen into it, and part of the rope was on top of him. He was taken out by the drift and carried home, but as stated, he died on Sunday morning. So obviously then, either this shaft, well, that shaft was down to the drift, as was this one, but they were working below drift level as well, and it sounds like they were raising coal up to the drift level. A bit complicated, but yeah, it's an interesting piece of information. Very sad that the guy died in such a way. And again, it is illustrated a little bit on this cross sections we've shown you before. There's the drift, the horse road going in, intersecting the seams, and it shows this pit here descending down. It doesn't show a lot about it, does it? But it shows that there was a shaft also within the drift there.
So really, it's fitting that we've got the Miners' Memorial behind us, isn't it? And I hasten to add, I had sadly nothing to do with this. A lot of this, I believe, is Jack Naden, well, the late Jack Naden, and Donna Maiden's work, and a lot of other people put the time, money and effort into this fantastic memorial that's left for us of all the Burnley colliers and drawers, everybody that works underground who sadly lost their lives in the Burnley coalfield. Back in July of 1814, after they'd caught Napoleon Bonaparte, they sent him off to St Helena. Well, they had a big party. Lots of places had big parties, but by subscription, a lot of the well-to-do and middle-class people of Burnley got together to put a fancy dinner on for all the poor people. Normal people just like you and me, in other words. Maybe even some of the pitmen from here. And there was over 3,000 people turned up. There was 4 massive tables round Bullcroft and a stage set in the middle of that. The morning started off with cannon fire and peals of bells from all the churches and what have you. And the people that came to dine, well, they had to bring their own knives and forks, but they were provided with 3 pints of strong ale each. Carcasses from 7 fat cows. So they had a right good dinner. And during the time of that dinner, obviously, Colonel Hargreaves kept giving toasts to his great majesty, and a band played. But it's interesting to note as well that some of the local militia were just to one side there, keeping their eye on things to make sure things didn't get out of hand. Right, so we're on Grimshire Street, which was the Coal Pit Road. It's a bit different now. We're going to have a look at the names of a couple of these streets. This is Grimshire Street. We're going to go on to Manchester Road, which was then Market Street. And then we're going to have a look down Hargreaves Street. So Grimshire Street was named after the Grimshires, obviously. Nicholas Grimshire and John Hargreaves sort of sharing the inheritance for a start, wasn't there? And if Hargreaves Street, if we look on the map, this was the first to be built. And it was built really, as they said, for middle class housing. And then it became sort of like a well-to-do business area. We got like doctors, bank, things like that, you know, solicitors and what have you. You can see with some of the buildings behind us, you know, quite well to do. I don't know much about the history of Burnley architecture, obviously. And the next street there is called Ormerod Street. Can we see the connection? And then further down, we've got Coal Street. So Grimshire Street, Hargreaves Street, Ormerod Street, and then Coal Street. So we're at the bottom of Manchester Road, or as it used to be, Market Street. And this was the original turnpike road through to Manchester. So all the... Hi. Yeah, I'm alright, good.
You got man, yeah? Investigating Burnley Town Center. They tell you, what was the YouTube channel called?
Yeah. So yeah. Behind us was the bull. The original bull inn was further down, which again, this was part of the Fullage estate. The Hargreaves family inherited it, and in 1819, after the Battle of Peterloo, when it was the Burnley meeting, the bull down there, that's where Colonel Hargreaves sort of mastered his troops together for the Burnley meeting, because he knew that the people were kind of coming tooled up. He actually did something good there, did Colonel Hargreaves, because he averted a riot, really, to be honest with you. There would have been a bloodbath had they really got involved. But anyway, this is where the coaches used to come in from Manchester to the more modern Bull Hotel. Further down on that side was the Thorn Inn, or Thorn Hotel, whichever it was, and that is where the landlord there at one time, he also leased the Fullage Pit, but I think he leased that off Blackmore. Anyway, this is where the coaches used to come in, thundering down the road, and I believe if you read some of the reports, it's a bit like the Hell Drivers, if you remember that great film there. But this is where the famous words were spoken by one of the coach drivers. He was asked by one of his customers, and what's Burnley all about? What does Burnley do? And he answered him, cotton, clogs and coils. And for those uneducated, coil is coal. Right, so to wrap up, this is where the pit was, just behind us. Shaft just inside the magistrate's court. That's going to horrify them, innit? The pits of hell are going to open up to them. And the tram road across here, horse-drawn obviously, and then across, under, into Tesco's. And under the canal bank, obviously the canal embankment. Yeah, it would have been there when the drift was driven. I'm that much of an anorak, I'm wondering which aisle at Tesco's it goes under. Now then, thanks for watching the video. I want to come back and I want to do a bit more on the fullage, the actual full edge colliery side of it, not the Bullcroft side of Hargreaves is here. So we'll do that in a couple of weeks' time. Hopefully it'll be a bit warmer than it is today. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to treat myself on the way home to a steak pudding, a proper Holland steak pudding, because you can't get them up in Cumbria. And for some reason, you go in a chippy up in Cumbria and ask for a babby's head on a barm, and they think you're right daft. Now it's funny as folk. Catch you next time.